Welcome to the 11th session of the KIPS Distance Learning Program Current Affairs Newspaper Roundup session. I am Shahrukh Haider, your very own host, and here I am going to present to you another one of my special lectures on the Middle Eastern crisis and the constant wars that have taken place in that region and what does that mean. So as we previously discussed in the previous lecture, how the Arab Spring basically led to a number of conflicts and a number of instabilities and civil wars in the Middle Eastern region. One of those wars was a civil war that started in Syria in 2011, where it is precisely where the Arab Spring kind of came to a halt and did not spread beyond Syria into Iraq and then on into Iran. So what happened is that since the regime of Syria, the Bashar al-Assad government, who was a monarch in Syria, has been an authoritative and regressive regime who hasn't really given much rights to his own citizens, and the economic conditions are very poor in Syria, were very poor before the civil war started, and there is mass unemployment, and basically a crisis situation was already present in Syria, and the country was beaming with revolutionary spirit already against the Assad government. So the Arab Spring provided a lot of momentum to those people who were sick and tired of the Assad government and wanted the status quo to change. So in 2011, early 2011, a student in Syria painted a revolutionary slogan onto the wall of his school, and the police forces there, the Assad government police forces, literally killed that boy on the spot. That led to mass protests all over the country because that news spread like fire, and the people started to rise up in peaceful mass protest and agitation against the Assad government in 7 to 8 major cities. So in order to stem these protests, in order to discourage them from becoming more, gaining more momentum, Assad government forces started to clamp down on them heavily and violently. They started to fire upon them and kill a lot of protesters. So that is when those protesters also took up arms in order to defend themselves, and that is the official beginning of the Syrian Civil War. Now, a lot of soldiers from the Syrian forces of Bashar al-Assad defected from the Syrian army and joined the rebel forces and created the Syrian Free Army. So that is when the fighting really started, and in 2012, as the fighting intensified between the Bashar al-Assad government forces and the rebel forces, the civil war was going on, a lot of regional militias, terrorist groups and extremists sought this opportunity to build themselves up and entered the civil war, because in the extremist groups, terrorist organizations and militias gain momentum and importance and training and a lot of other incentives when they are actively engaged in a war. Otherwise, when they're not, their importance is not that pertinent, which is why a lot of regional militias entered the Syrian Civil War, and that is also when Al-Qaeda, who had its headquarters in neighboring Iraq, also established its regional affiliate in Syria by the name of Al-Nusra Front to conduct anti-state activities against Bashar al-Assad and spread its agenda of terrorism around the region. So that's when the Kurds, who were present in the northeast of Syria and who have historically not been granted their freedoms, their constitutional rights by the Assad government, and they have basically been, as most Middle Eastern experts say, the orphans of the world, because there are nearly 5 to 6 million Kurdish people combinedly in Iran, Iraq, Syria and Turkey, and they have not been granted their own state, even though a lot of great powers have promised them that they will get their own states in the past, like for example the British Empire when they were carving up borders in this region, and the US, and this is a promise that the US is going to make again in the civil war and not fulfill that promise. More on that later. So this is when the Kurds break their alliance with the Assad and start to bomb the Assad government forces and join the rebels in the civil war against the Assad government. That is when Assad reaches out to its old historic ally Iran, because we understand that in the 1980s and 1990s Iran helped make a ring of alliance in this region with Iran, Syria and the Hezbollah and Hamas in the Palestinian territories, to be a ring of alliances to counter the growing influence of the Saudi-led bloc in this region, and this power tussle has been going on ever since then between the Saudi-led bloc and the Iran-led bloc. So that is when in 2013 Hezbollah entered the civil war to support the Bashar al-Assad government on behalf of Iran, and Iran was already sending in oil shipments and training and arms to these Bashar al-Assad government forces to help them win the civil war against the Syrian Free Army rebels. So that is really when the Syrian civil war transforms into a proxy war, because as soon as Hezbollah enters and Iran enters into the theater of war in Syria, so does Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Council allies, who start funding and training and supporting and giving arms to the rebel forces against the Assad government to help them win the civil war and establish a pro-Saudi Arabian regime in future Syria after the civil war, so that the historic alliance between Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and in Lebanon, Hezbollah and Hamas in Palestine, this ring of alliance can be broken. So a little word on this ring of alliance. Iraq initially was not part of this alliance as long as the Saddam Hussein Ba'athist regime was present in Iraq, but immediately following the overthrow of the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein and the murder of Saddam Hussein by the Iraqi invasion by US in 2003, Iran has been constantly engaged in the internal politics and dynamics of the Iraqi society, of the Iraqi political structure, in order to create its ground and its feet within the Iraqi Republic, to make Iraq a sort of a client state for Iran. And to some extent, Iran has succeeded in that, because much of what happens in Iraq does not happen without the direct consent of the Iranian establishment. So this is a ring of alliance, and obviously, naturally, Iran wanted to prevent the ring of alliance from breaking up from one of its historic allies losing the wars, the civil war in Syria, that was the Bashar al-Assad government. So in 2013, in order to deter the rebel forces, Bashar al-Assad government used chemical weapons against his own civilians and killed a lot of people. Now, you must understand that the use of chemical weapons is banned under international law. It is considered a weapon of mass destruction, and any government force or any state that uses such devastating and weapons of mass destruction against its own citizens loses the sovereignty to rule over its own people, and then it is up to another foreign power to intervene on behalf of those people to preserve their rights and to prevent any massacre from taking place in that war theater under the pretext of humanitarian intervention. And that is exactly the pretext that the United States used in Iraq as well, although much of that, in fact all of that, was a bunch of lies. We got to know about that later on. Anyhow, so after the chemical weapons were used, the United States was outraged at the number of casualties and the violation of international law by the Syrian Assad government, and that is when the US decided to intervene and enter the theater of the war, and that is when the CIA started to fund, support and arm the Syrian rebels against the Bashar al-Assad government. So since the Bashar al-Assad government was mostly concerned about preserving and protecting some of the major key cities in Syria, which were mostly located in western and southern Syria, so the Assad government withdrew majority of its forces from northeast and north Syria back to the southern and the western part of Syria. Now that created, and much of the fighting then between the rebel forces and the Syrian government took place in the southern and the western Syria. So that is when a power vacuum was created in the north and the east of Syria, and that is where the Kurds was also stationed, and they were also fighting against Bashar al-Assad forces. But this power vacuum was suddenly capitalized by one important group, which really changed the direction and the nature of this civil war and this very complicated conflict, which has led to millions of casualties and a huge refugee crisis. We will talk about that a little later on. So the power vacuum was then exploited by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Now you must understand that the Islamic State was originally a part of the Al-Qaeda network, but due to internal disagreements over the leadership of Al-Qaeda and between the high command of Al-Qaeda, the group separated itself and emerged as a separate terrorist organization and vowed to create a caliphate in this region and an Islamic state. And that is when they started to materialize their objective of creating an Islamic state, and then they declared their own Khalifa, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and they started an international campaign of jihad all around the world, instigating fundamental Muslims all around the world to carry out attacks against Western targets, against non-Muslim targets, against even Muslim targets that the Islamic State considered to be in any way not compliant to their worldview of what Islam should be, which was a very puritanical and narrow and archaic form of Sharia that they had implemented within the ISIS territory. So from 2013 until 2016, the ISIS captured nearly 1/3 of Iraq and 1/3 of Syria and became a state, a country of sorts, bigger than the United Kingdom. And it then emerged as a very important power broker and a serious security threat to all of the regional parties that were involved in the conflict. So the only credible forces against the rise of the ISIS were the Kurdish militias and the Kurdish forces who were fighting for their own autonomy, to gain their own statehood within Syria and become an independent nation, something that they deserve and something which is their natural right of self-determination ensured under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So once the ISIS started to gain all of this territory and conduct massive online terror campaigns all around the world and instigate Muslims, a lot of terrorist attacks started to happening in the hundreds all around the Western world, in Australia, in Europe, in Africa, in North America, in Latin America, and ISIS really spread its tentacle all around the world. That is when the US really started to become serious about fighting the ISIS and eliminating this threat beyond its preferences in the conventional Syrian Civil War, which was essentially to make Assad government fall and to establish the rebels as a new democratic government in Syria. But now US's priorities completely shifted solely to the great threat that was ISIS, and in order to curb that threat, it started to take action. So in late 2015, as ISIS was rising at a monstrous pace, meteoric rise, it was starting to threaten the established government of Bashar al-Assad, and Bashar al-Assad was becoming increasingly weak in the Syrian Civil War because he was under attack from three different sections. That was the ISIS, the Syrian rebels, and the Kurds. And the support that Iran and Hezbollah was given to Assad was not sufficient to counter all of these threats that were emerging in the region. And that is when Russia came to the aid of Bashar al-Assad government, which was a historic ally of the Soviet Union back in the Cold War days as well. So Russia then started its air strike campaigns against the rebel forces and against the Kurd forces in order to help the Bashar al-Assad government survive the Syrian Civil War and emerge as a victor, so that the Bashar al-Assad government could remain in power. So in 2015, the ISIS really reached the peak of its power, and now it was threatening to completely transform the Syrian heartland and end the Syrian Bashar al-Assad government and end the rebel forces and severely threaten the interest of the Kurds. And that is when majority of the parties that are involved in the Syrian Civil War turned their weapons and their guns on towards the Islamic State. And because of the meteoric rise of Islamic State and the ongoing war, continuous bloody and very devastating war through much of Syria, an international refugee crisis developed in Syria, where nearly 6 million Syrian refugees escaped Syria into Turkey, into other parts of Middle East, and into Europe. Now, majority of those, 3.6 million of those, landed up in Turkey, which was a major burden on Turkey's economy, on Turkey's society, on Turkey's politics, and really transformed Turkey's internal politics as well. Similarly, the refugee crisis also had a profound impact on the politics of Europe, because it led to the rise of right-wing nationalism and right-wing populist parties that had neo-Nazi ideologies and were extremely Islamophobic and xenophobic, and to an extent they wanted to push all of the immigrants out of their countries, and they had very consistent ideas of their motherhood, their nationhood, and this nationalism really took hold in European politics and undid a lot of democratic credentials of Europe, where such neo-Nazi parties as the alternate for Germany political party in Germany really took hold in the political scene of Germany, where before it was completely irrelevant, but now it was increasingly becoming an important, and still is an important, power broker in the political scene in Germany, and it was voted to the Parliament of Germany on a huge mandate as well. So a lot of changes and dramatic events have been the consequence of the Syrian Civil War, the ever evolving and complicated Syrian Civil War, which really reflects the kind of broader politics that have been present within the Middle Eastern region for the past, maybe 7 decades, 70, 80 years, ever since the World War II. The drama has been constantly evolving in the Middle East, and the complexity and the number of actors in the Syrian Civil War really reflect how many differing interests and stakes are present in this region, and how violently they will fight to achieve those stakes. So this is when majority of the parties start to point their gun against the ISIS state, and one clear objective emerges in the very complex and confusing civil war, where the United States, Russia, the Kurds, the Iranian establishment in the region, Shia militias, and the Bashar al-Assad government join forces essentially against ISIS to bring it down. So the most effective group against the ISIS then emerges the Kurdish militias, who join their forces with non-Kurdish militias to form the Syrian Democratic Front, also known as the SDF. And the SDF really gives the fight to the ISIS and starts to break down their terror camps and their hold on territories, and break down their prisoner camps, and the fight is really taken into the headquarters of the ISIS, which is the Aleppo in Syria, Aleppo city, and they are successful in to a large extent liberating the city and ending the reign of terror that was in place by the ISIS. And that is really when the Syrian Democratic Front forces, the SDF and the Kurds, start to emerge as an important power brokers in the greater civil war, because that is still ensuing, remember. And one of the main reasons for that is also the United States support for the Kurdish militias and the Syrian Democratic Front, which supports them militarily, financially, with arms, and with whatever support the CIA can give to the Kurdish forces in terms of intelligence. But the problem is that this is also the time when Turkey enters the conflict, but instead of bombing and fighting against ISIS, Turkey starts to fight only and bomb only Kurdish targets in the north-eastern part of Syria, which is the border of Turkey with Syria, because Turkey has other interests, competing interests in the border areas of Syria, and we will talk about that a little later. So the problem is that since Kurds are allied with the United States, and Turkey is a historic ally of the United States and part of the NATO alliance as well, and in the greater Cold War days, Turkey and the United States had close alliances as well, but now Turkey is fighting one of the close allies of the United States in Syrian civil war, which are the Kurds. So the alliances are very confusing, and there are a lot of players in this complicated civil war, and nobody really knows what's really happening and who's our friend and who's our enemy, and camps are constantly changing with time and with developments. So then, with Russian air support and Iranian support and Hezbollah support, Bashar al-Assad government does something smart. He intelligently, while the rebel forces and the Kurdish forces are fighting the ISIS, and Assad government is also fighting the ISIS, he intelligently behind their back, starts attacking the rebel forces and the Kurdish forces and start to weaken them. And that is when really the Aleppo city is retaken by the Bashar al-Assad government from the rebels, and he established the government writ there once again, and substantially reduces the strength of the rebel forces. And that is when Assad starts to rise up once again in the Syrian Civil War, because initially the Assad government was on the brink of losing the war and seeing its end. But now Bashar al-Assad government is emerging as the most important and powerful player in the Syrian Civil War. And that is when in 2017 Bashar al-Assad government once again uses chemical weapons against his own civilians and kills nearly 80 to 90 people in chemical attacks. Once again, this is a gross violation of international law and Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, in 2016, we must remember that Trump was elected to the presidency of United States, and he declared during his campaign and after becoming president that United States will completely withdraw from Middle East and especially the Syrian Civil War, and they now favor the Bashar al-Assad government to remain in power, whereas the original Obama administration sought the removal of Bashar al-Assad government. But now the United States was like, all right, we are fine with the status quo as long as the fighting and the violence ends. But after the chemical attack, Trump is enraged, and that is when for the first time United States directly attacks the Assad government forces using missile attacks and whatnot. So in 2018, much of the ISIS stronghold in Syria and Iraq has been defeated. ISIS is now on the back foot. It nearly controls even less than 1/10 of the land that it used to control at its height in 2016. And the Kurds and the non-Kurd forces that form the Syrian Democratic Front, as we talked before, have now claimed victory over ISIS, and so did the United States. And this is when ISIS, in order to survive as an ideology, moves all around the world into other conflict zones, into other unstable regions, such as the civil war was also going on in Yemen. So ISIS shifts its ideology, and it's a lot of fighters and recruits and creates a movement in Yemen as well, then in Afghanistan, then in Malaysia, and now it becomes an important international network of jihadists and terrorist groups and sleeper cells whose primary goal is to target Western targets and try to undermine all the presence and the efforts of Western governments in the developing world, and especially in the Muslim world. So this is when the Syrian forces in the northeast of Syria declare that region, much of which now they conquered from the ISIS-held territory, as an autonomous region. That is where they enact a sort of a democratic system within that region, and the West hails it as the emergence of a democracy in a conflict-ridden and monarchy-ridden Middle Eastern region, and they really declare themselves as an autonomous region and separate from the Bashar al-Assad government. However, they are being attacked by Turkish forces and Bashar al-Assad forces as well, and their establishment of their republic is under a lot of threat. Now, since they develop this region, which they call Rajaka, as a autonomous region, Turkey starts to feel insecure for its border, because this region is directly on the border of Turkey. And remember, Turkey has had its own Kurdish problem, where in the southern part of Turkey, on the border of Syria and Turkey, there are nearly 1 million Kurdish citizens present in Turkey who have fought against the Turkish government establishment for nearly 3 decades to gain their independence, and that movement is called PKK, and their primary goal was to seek an autonomous status either or a completely independent state from the Turkish Republic. So the Turkish Republic and the Turkish administration feels that the Rajaka autonomous region and the Kurdish democratic forces are basically a proxy for the PKK and present a national security threat to Turkish security. So that is when the war takes a new turn, because as we know, ISIS has to a large extent been defeated. Assad is on the rise. The rebel forces are losing much of the ground, and in 2/3 of Syria, Assad government has established his writ and is continuing his assault against the opposition rebel forces and constantly driving them back into their quarters. So the rise of the Kurds present a decade-old alliance, and this is when, in order to contain any situation where a new terrorist organization might emerge, like it emerged in 2014 in the case of ISIS. So in order to prevent any creation of power vacuum, the United States declared the United States will create an international security force on the border of Syria and Turkey, constituting majorly of Kurd militias and Kurdish forces. And this is something that the Turkish Republic outrightly rejects and says that this is going to be a terrorist organization that is going to be aimed to destabilizing Turkey and starting a civil war against Turkey. And Turkey really dramatically threatens United States and Kurdish forces, and already preemptively starts a heavy strike and heavy war against the Kurdish targets on the Syrian land. So this is when the relationship between Turkey and United States, which have been historic allies, really starts to deteriorate, and this is late 2018. And that is when Turkey does not allow any sort of ceasefire or any stable situation to evolve in northeastern part of Syria, which is a border with Turkey, so that no such international security force can be established in this region, which would present a security threat to the Turkish Republic, right? Meanwhile, fighting is already going on in one of the most important cities in Syria, in the city of Mosul, between Bashar al-Assad forces, the government forces, and the rebel forces, and to a large extent the government forces are winning, and in early 2019 the government forces are able to retake Mosul city from the rebels, which was one of their strongholds, and the rebels once again retreat further into the western part of Syria. So Turkey really tries to create, and this is something that Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has been saying for quite a number of years, that they want to create a safe zone on the border of Turkey and Syria, which is going to be 30 km wide and 480 km long, in order to ensure that no more power vacuum can be created, and in order to resettle the 3.6 Syrian refugees present in Turkey, which are a major economic burden and security burden and political burden upon the Republic of Turkey, back into Syria, into the safe zone to be created. But no one really paid a lot of attention and agreed to that. So that's when Turkey decided that, and it really gave this message to the world, that if the world does not agree with Turkey's idea of creating a safe zone, then Turkey will go ahead with it without the world support. And that is when Turkey really ramps up its military campaign against the Kurdish forces, against the Syrian Democratic Front. But one of the major hurdles in Turkey's efforts to undermine Kurdish forces is the presence of US military bases and US troops in this very region, which the Turkey wants to create as a safe zone. But then, after negotiation between Turkey and the United States agrees to completely withdraw all its forces and its installments from the northeastern Turkey. That is when really the Turkish Republic starts its full-out offense against the Kurdish militias and the Kurdish autonomous region of Raqqa, and that is when a new war starts within the original civil war in Syria, where Turkey is now determined to break the back of the Kurdish forces in order to prevent them from creating any instability or any revolutionary spirit or any rebellion within the Turkish Republic against the PKK and the Turkish government. So this is something, after the withdrawal of the United States forces, Turkey is also able to convince Iran and Russia for its vision of a future Syria, where this safe zone will be created. Now that is where the Syrian Civil War currently stands. It's 9 years since the war started, and it has yet to be concluded. No one is really sure what's going to happen moving forward, but the problem with this war is that it keeps on evolving, new players keep on entering, and the conflict starts in one region and then another and between other parties, and it's a constant mayhem, it's a constant violent struggle for the control of the Syrian state. But many analysts say that Bashar al-Assad government, with the support of Syria and Iran and Hezbollah, has been able to re-establish his writ and his government in Syria, and in future there are very positive chances that he will retain his position as the monarch of Syria and re-establish the status quo that was there before the 2011 civil war started. Now the future and the fate of Kurds is still unsure. No one really knows what kind of solution will be reached towards them, because in return for helping fighting the ISIS, the United States promised the Kurdish people that they will help them gain independence and their own state in 2016. But once again, the US did not fulfill that promise. Now the Kurdish question is an important question in the Middle Eastern region, and they have been fighting for their freedom, for their right of self-determination for quite some time now. Now in 2016, at the brink and at the height of the rise of the ISIS, something interesting also happened in the northwestern Iraq and the Kurdish region in Iraq, where the Kurds of Iraq declared a referendum and then declared independence from the Iraqi Republic, from the Iraq government in Baghdad, simultaneously to the referendum and the independence move that was going on in Catalonia, Spain, which is very interesting because Spain is a democratic modern state with a liberal democratic society where a referendum and human rights and right to self-determination makes a lot more sense. But at the same time, in this region, which is extremely unstable, full of conflict, civil wars here and there, and a gross lack of democratic values and despotic monarchs reigning over the entire region, such acts of democracy can also take place. And this is what really separates the Kurdish people from the rest of the ethnicities and groups within the Middle Eastern region, because they are very different in their outlook. They give equal rights to their women. They have their own women forces who fought against the ISIS and against Bashar al-Assad government alongside their men, and they have a kind of a democratic culture to an extent where popular representation is an important part of their culture, and they're really emerging as an important power broker in the Syrian Civil War. Perhaps they might be able to break up Syria and get their own state, who knows, but the chances of that happening are slim, but they are still present. So with that, I hope you understand what is the Syrian Civil War and how complicated it is. Be sure to click show more in the video description, because I have added relevant content that will help you understand these conflicts on a more basic level and help you answer any questions that might appear in the future.